Today we're talking about how poetry can treat history. That is something that is happening in the bigger world than the domestic world, and that is of importance to the poet. Both things have to be true. It has to have as much importance as any feeling, inner feeling that is expressed in a private lyric, but it also has to have the sense that the poem wants to take shape. It can't just be a shapeless thing. History, as we know, is one long continuum with no breaks in it. We make artificial breaks and call them periods, the 20th century, the 21st century. But history itself has no such breaks and disregards all barriers and all boundaries. You write about history, historical events, depending on your own relation to them. And this week we see 3 poems with a different relation in each case to the historical event that is happening. The first one I'm not going to talk about because you can read in the anthology. The poem itself is on page 243. I'm talking about Robert Lowell's The March 1. And you can read through to page 246, and it talks about all the means that the poem employs to make its own reality real on the page. It's a sonnet, that is to say, Lowell chooses a brief form to represent a brief moment in time, the march on Washington against the Vietnam War, in which he participated. It's written about by Norman Mailer in The Armies of the Night, where he describes Lowell on this march. Lowell was not himself an activist, but he participated, as many people did, because the war was involving every citizen of America. When he takes this slice of time, he represents himself with various feelings, and one of the feelings is an anger against imperial America, that everything is too big here. The Washington Monument is too big, the pool is too long, etc. But by the end, when the army counters the marchers, he finds himself in the position of somebody being hunted down by his own army in the whole riot gear that the army are wearing, that the soldiers are wearing. So that's the fear that he feels at the end when the soldier coming at him seems to him like a Martian or like an ape or like a hero, because we have all seen heroic sculptures of men in battle. He hardly knows what to feel. So he retails his own mixed emotions towards his own country, towards his wish to end the war, and then he ends up in the confrontation with soldiers, and just as he's new to activism, they are new to being soldiers. The next 2 poems that I want to talk about at more length are from 2 different perspectives. Neither person is a participant. Wonderful war poems have been written by non-participants in our own literature. Walt Whitman is probably the greatest of the non-participant war poets. But he sometimes writes in a soldier's voice, taking on the persona of a soldier himself, as in The Artilleryman's Vision, where he is the artilleryman, though he was never in battle himself. Easter 1916, a poem by William Butler Yeats, is about a crucial event in the history of Ireland. It was an uprising, an armed uprising, on Easter Monday, 1916, while World War I was still going on and England was still a part of it. And it's about the people who are manning the guns and setting off the grenades and killing English soldiers. These men, many of them had been his friends. There came a moment when the revolutionary arm of the Irish, what shall I say, call them patriots, call them terrorists, when they decided to take up arms against Britain. They were for bombings, they were for assassinations, and he just couldn't enlist in that particular moral code. So once you know that your friends are in cellars making bombs after they come home from work, and you cross them in the street, what can you say? You can't say, why are you doing this foolish thing? You can't say, how is the bomb making going? You can't say, stop right away, you might get killed. No, you pass them and do the one thing that is a sin for a poet, to utter polite, meaningless words. Meaningless words have no part in the life of a poet. When he talks about the rising, the Easter rising, he does not show the events themselves. And he did in another poem, but not here. That is, he talks about the people who made the events happen and what he thought their participation in terrorism, killing, did to their own characters and how they changed from the people he had known earlier. When he first refers to them, he doesn't refer to them by their names at all. He simply points them out with adjectives, that man, that woman, and so on. He uses the far away adjective, those, these, those, rather than the near pronominal adjective, these or this. Let me read you the first two parts. Speaking about his friends, Easter 1916. I have met them at close of day, coming with vivid faces from counter or desk among gray 18th century houses. I have passed with a nod of the head, or polite, meaningless words, or have lingered a while and said polite, meaningless words, and thought before I had done of a mocking tale or a jibe to please a companion around the fire at the club, being certain that they and I but lived where mothly is worn. All changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. Motley is the jester's wear, the clown's wear, the multicolored striped clothes, blue, yellow, blue, yellow, blue, yellow, and a fool's cap on the head. Now he has learned that whatever the people were that were doing this, they were not fools, that they were brave and that they were deeply mistaken. He begins by pointing out the individual rebels one by one, sometimes using the far off adjective that, sometimes using the close adjective this, and depending on how far they are from him in closeness and in friendship, he goes from the that to the this. This is how he points them out. That woman's days were spent in ignorant goodwill, her nights in argument until her voice grew shrill. What voice more sweet than hers when, young and beautiful, she rode to Harrier's? This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse, Pegasus. This other, his helper and friend, was coming into his force. He might have won fame in the end. So sensitive his nature seemed, so daring and sweet his thought. This other man I had dreamed a drunken, vainglorious lout. He had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart, yet I number him in the song. He too has resigned his part in the casual comedy. He too has been changed in his turn, transformed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. We have no name, no events, no historical account of the events, objective account. Instead, the poet departs from the poem he has been writing, departs totally. It's no longer about the rebellion itself, it's about fanaticism and what people who become fanatics, who are willing to bomb other people, assassinate other people, kill other people, what that does to them as human beings. Yeats's view is that it turns their hearts to stone. In the Bible, God says, I have given you hearts of flesh, but you have turned them to hearts of stone. A heart of stone can't bleed, it can't beat, it can't do anything but resist. And that's what the men and women in the streets are doing, resisting the British soldiers. And they have no other aim at this moment in their life. They're not thinking of their children, if they have any. They're not thinking of their wives. They're not thinking of their parents. They have one aim and one aim only. That is to say, they have turned into fanatics. Hearts with one purpose alone, through summer and winter, seem enchanted to a stone to trouble the living stream. The horse that comes from the road, the rider, the birds that range from cloud to tumbling cloud, minute by minute they change. A shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute. A horse slides on the brim, and a horse plashes within it. The long-legged moorhens dive, and hens to moorcocks call. Minute by minute they live, the stones in the midst of all. Everything in nature changes minute by minute. The flux of life continues unbroken. The activities of life go on. The cocks call to the hens. The rider rides his horse through the stream. Horsehoof slides on the brim. And that sense of perpetual, constant change is the very definition of life, as Yeats understands it. But these people have stopped dead in their lives and had turned to stones to trouble the living stream, to interrupt the current of life, the flow of life, and to introduce death into the picture of life. His picture of life and change doesn't include death, you'll notice. It's just the continual flux of all that is living. But they have chosen death. He thinks back to Hamlet. When Hamlet wonders about his mother's guilt in the murder of his father, he knows that Claudius is guilty, and he knows that his mother has married Claudius, but there are any number of reasons, chiefly terror, why she might marry the man who had murdered her husband, so he wouldn't murder her too. Or, on the other hand, she may be only pretending to be in love with him, which he requires of her, or indeed she may be in love with him, and that was one of his motives in killing Hamlet's father. Hamlet simply doesn't know, and throughout the whole play he doesn't know, he never knows. When he wonders how he should behave towards his mother, he says to himself, leave her to heaven. Only God can judge her motives, the extent of her guilt, the extent of her collaboration with his uncle now on the throne. It's too complex a moral problem for Hamlet to solve. Leave her to heaven, he says. Yeats thinks of the sacrifice of their lives that these patriots/terrorists are making. And the sacrifice has gone on already for some time while they were making the bombs in the cellars and readying their militia and developing their plans of battle. And he wonders how long, once you have a fixed purpose in life, you must keep it up. Too long a sacrifice can make a stone of the heart. Oh, when may it suffice? Then he abandons judgment. That is heaven's part. Then what is our part? Our part is to murmur name upon name as a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. This is a patronizing view of the patriots. It sees them as adolescents at best, children who come in from their play and whose mothers have to put them down to sleep and sing them to sleep, and then just say something like, boys will be boys. This is not the way any of these patriots would want to have been regarded, and it puts Yeats himself, their elegist, in a superior position to them, as there, you delinquent boys. That is not what he should be saying, and he comes to realize that because he sees that it is a deception to say, well, it's just like a child going to sleep, these men who have died. The woman did not die, Constance Markovitch. She was pardoned because she was a woman, but men were put to death, and that caused the general problem of Ireland being ruled by England to take a place at center stage in the country's life. It was not resolved for several years until after a civil war and the partition of Ireland. But no one at this moment could have known what would be the outcome of this armed uprising. As a mother names her child when sleep at last has come on limbs that had run wild. What is it but nightfall? And he checks himself. No, not night, but death. Was it needless death after all? For England may keep faith for all it has done and said. England had promised home rule to Ireland at the end of the First World War. It was still going on, the war, so England had not failed in its promise, but neither had it kept its promise during the war. Again, everything was uncertain about the future. He gives up the parliamentary question. Was it needless death after all? Could all of this have been solved by parliamentary means, which is what he himself had hoped? Now he characterizes them in a different way. We know their dream, the dream of a free Ireland, no longer governed by England. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. He has said, oh, when may it suffice? Now he has another word for sufficing. It's enough. All we have to know is their noble aim and the fact that they died in the service, as they believed it, at least, of their country. And he tries to assimilate them to other heroes by saying that they died for love of country. They died for love, of excessive love, perhaps, because he doesn't approve of their ultimate actions, but he's willing to call it an act of love, not simply an act of rebellious children or an act of misguided men. We know their dream, enough to know they dreamed and are dead. And what if excess of love bewildered them till they died? They were not fully conscious of the ramifications of their actions. They had been bewildered. Bewildered goes back to limbs that had run wild. It's no longer their insufficiency of thought running wild like adolescents, but rather it is that in all the pressures upon them and their country, they had become confused, bewildered. That too is patronizing them, but at least he sees that it's out of love rather than out of hatred that they had fought. He gives up on trying to characterize them after granting that their dream was a dream driven by love of country, driven by patriotism. And then he comes back to what is our part. That is heaven's part to judge them. Our part to murmur name upon name. Murmuring name upon name would be to say it in a hushed, reverent tone of voice, but a soft tone of voice, a murmur scarcely hearable. Instead, he changes his mind at the very end and decides to make the poem into a roll call of heroes. We know that he intends it to be thought of as a roll call of heroes because he names them by their last name. Heroes no longer have first names. We say Washington, Lincoln. We don't say George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, we say Grant and Lee for the heroes of the Civil War. We say it for presidents, Kennedy, Nixon, Reagan. We say last names when people have become famous, whether for good deeds or for bad. But he, of course, because he thinks now that they acted out of excess of love in a bewildered and confused way, he at last can treat them as the heroes they are, and he does a kind of muster, a roll call of the heroes. He doesn't murmur name upon name, he hails them name upon name. I write it out in a verse. By saying I write it out in a verse, he takes upon himself the traditional role of the Irish bard to celebrate the battle victories of the king, to write a living history in verse of what the king had done, so that he takes upon himself a serious social purpose as the bard to register an important event in the history of Ireland. I write it out in a verse. And then we learn who those anonymous people were. MacDonagh, Thomas MacDonagh, a poet. He might have won fame in the end. MacBride, the drunken, vainglorious lout who had done most bitter wrong to some who are near my heart. MacBride had married the woman that Yeats was in love with. He then treated her very ill and molested her daughter. So bitter wrong there was indeed. But he had died in the uprising and therefore had to be named as among the heroes. And Connolly, a socialist, and Peirce, who kept the school. This man had kept a school and rode our winged horse. Yeats was annoyed by the kind of cheap patriotism on offer in Ireland, wearing shamrocks on St. Patrick's Day. He thought of it all as sentimental gush and not true patriotism. But now he quotes a song that belonged to the movement, and it was a sentimental and, what shall I say, ignoble poem. It was not a noble piece of verse at all. And by citing it, he lets his own aesthetic bow before the aesthetic of revolution. The song is called The Wearing of the Green, that is to say, the wearing of the shamrock on St. Patrick's Day or on other patriotic occasions. And one of the stanzas says, "Oh, I met with Napper Tandy and I took him by the hand and I said, how's poor old Ireland and how does she stand? She's the most distressful country that ever yet was seen for the hanging men and women for the wearing of the green." You can see what kind of a poem it is, a kind of ballad poem. I write it out in a verse. MacDonagh and MacBride and Connolly and Peirce, now and in time to be, wherever green is worn, are changed utterly. A terrible beauty is born. That terrible beauty is the beauty of the sublime. The pretty beauty is the beauty of the beautiful, but when beauty reaches into violence and terror, it becomes the beauty of the sublime. And you could see that these heroes have been changed. They are in the position of the passive object of the verb. They have all been changed utterly. That's the passive form of the active verb that we saw in the third part, the allegorical part about the stone in the midst of the stream, when he says, minute by minute they change, a shadow of cloud on the stream changes minute by minute they live. That active changing is the verb of life, being changed is the verb of those whom history has somehow compelled into a position of heroism. Yeats writes this to an audience who will know all these names and know the life of all of these heroes, and who will have seen them proclaim the freedom of the Irish Republic, which they proclaimed in their battle against the English. Because the English executed the 16 men, they executed Connolly with a firing squad because he had been wounded sitting down in a chair, and spared only the woman. Because of those executions, the tide of feeling against Ireland rose very high and eventually caused, in the two factions in Ireland, the Civil War. And it was resolved, as I said, by the partition of Ireland into Northern Ireland, still ruled by England, and the Republic of Ireland. Yeats was not a participant. He looked on from the outside, and the purpose of his group elegy, because this is not an elegy for a single person, but an elegy for a group, is to make up his own mind about how he felt. And as you can see, he was full of mixed feelings. Sad that his friends had become estranged from him as they were making their bombs in their cellars and preparing their stores of rifles. Angry that they had ruined the lives of so many promising people, as he saw it. They had ruined their own lives. Pity, because they were young and were bewildered. And then, finally, admiration, as he does the roll call of heroes. Though all those mixed feelings survive into the poem, and no one of them wins over the others, he sent this poem to Maud Gonne, the woman he had been in love with, who had married Sean McBride, and she wrote him back, "I do not like your poem." Of course she didn't like it because it had mixed feelings. Mixed feelings are innate to poetry because feelings are always mixed, except in very extreme cases of massacre, murder. But here, his mixed feelings have made a lasting poem, even if Maud Gonne didn't like his poem. You can see that the poem rhymes in quatrains, four rhyme units: day, faces, gray houses, head words, said words, done jibe, companion club, I, worn, utterly bored. You can see that he allows himself slant rhymes. They don't have to be perfect rhymes, but he keeps to his 4-line units. He keeps to his 4-line units throughout. The units are either of 16 lines or of 24 lines. The 4-line units stand for April, January, February, March, April, the 4th month. The 16-line units stand for April 16th, the day that the uprising took place. And so Yeats is encoding in a numerological way the very date of the uprising. April 24th, 1916. 4/24/16, the length of the stanzas. I go on to the next poem, which is on page 274. That is the poem by Jorie Graham, written when she sees the military preparations by her own country, which are normally hidden from non-military personnel. In this case, out in Iowa, one of her students, she doesn't say that, and you don't need to know that, but a boy, obviously someone younger than herself, takes her out to this forbidden vantage place, which is behind the barbed wire that's supposed to keep people out, to see what is happening on the field below, which is a whole fleet of planes, B-52s, as he says, on alert. Sorry. Sorry. She sees a whole fleet of planes, B-52s, as she says, on alert in the runway, fully loaded, fully manned, pointed in all the directions, running every minute of every day. They sound like a sickness of the inner ear. She had no idea that there were fleets of planes being kept at the ready, consuming innumerable millions of gallons of fuel so they would be ready to scramble and go up right away if there was any kind of attack. And the boys sit in them, their pilots, all day in these humming engines. And this is not conveyed to the public. There are no pictures of the engines. There are no pictures of this field. There are not news stories about how we keep hundreds and hundreds of planes at various places, pointed in all directions, running all the time. So she sees this sight, and what is she to make of it? She's not a participant. It is being done in her name because it's being done by her country, but it's not being done by her. Sorry. She doesn't know what to think for a long time. She watches as the dusk slowly falls. The boy has picked her some meadow flowers from the meadow where they're lying on their bellies so they won't be seen by the guards watching the planes. And she wonders how to put her feelings about this almost inexplicable sight. And what she knows is that their law boy tells her the planes are all laden with bombs. They're going out to kill innumerable human bodies if they go. They're prepared to kill innumerable human bodies, civilians, non-civilians, but in any case, what she suddenly hears in her ear as the engines hum is the millions of screams of all the people who will be torn apart by shrapnel, by bombs, by guns. They sound like a sickness of the inner ear. She has addressed this poem to someone, but she doesn't tell you who the you is to whom she is speaking. It is only in line 64 that she gives the you an epithet. She calls the you love. So we know that it is her lover that she is addressing. We don't know their relationship. All we know is that this is the person closest to her at the moment, and that, as we learn as the poem goes on, the relationship is in bad trouble. They can no longer reconcile after a quarrel. She thinks then about domestic hostility as she thinks about national hostility. And she jump cuts from the national hostility in front of her to the domestic hostility when she and the man she's addressing stand in the kitchen at odds, at bay, each of them unable to move towards the other. When you come to the standstill of a war between two people and you can't reconcile and you can't make peace, then the state of war is continuous. And here she is, describing the state of war of her nation by describing the state of war of her domestic life. Finally, the dusk falls. That's when the lights on all the extremities, the wings, the tail, like an outline, like a dress, become loud in the story. And a dark I have not seen before sinks in to hold them one by one. strange plot made to hold so many inexhaustible screams. Have you ever heard in a crowd mutterings of blame that will not modulate, that will not rise? So these imagined screams are in her ear. They don't change, they don't rise. They're a continual mutter, 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 but it's this mutter of screams. He tells me, your stand-in, that tells us she'd rather be there with her lover. They step up. She looks more deeply in. He tells her, his whisper, more like a scream, she says in line 52, over this eternity of engines never not running is everything. How the crews assigned to each plane for a week at a time, the 7 boys must live inseparable, how they stay together for life, how the wings are given a life of 7 feet of play, how they drop practice bombs called shapes over Nevada, how the measures for counterattack in air have changed, and we now forego firepower for jamming, for the throwing of false signals. The meadow hums love with the plains as if every last blade of grass were wholly possessed by this practice, wholly prepared. And that's comes to the jump cut to her domestic life. The last time I saw you, we stood facing each other as dusk came on. I leaned against the refrigerator. You leaned against the door. The picture window behind you was slowly extinguished. The tree went out, the 2 bird feeders, the metal braces on them. The light itself took a long time. Bits in puddles, stuck like the useless splinters of memory, of their past, the chips of history in the larger national question, laws handed down as the laws could control a population. She jumps back to the boy with her in the meadow. Here, hold these, he says, these grasses, these torn pods, he says, smiling over the noise, another noise. Take these, he says. My hand's wrong for the purpose here. She's not there to take flowers. She realizes she's there to record the scene, to be a poet of the event. Here, she's in the meadow, not visible from the sky. Prepare yourself with these, boy and bouquet of thistleweed and wort and William and Timothy. Prepare yourself as the bombs are being prepared, as the planes are being prepared for whatever future is coming on. Back to her domestic scene in the kitchen. We stood there in the dusk. Your face went out a long time before the rest of it. Can't see you anymore, I said. Nor I, you, whatever you still were, replied. When I asked you to hold me, you refused. When I asked you to cross the 6 feet of room to hold me, you refused. Until I couldn't rise out of the patience either any longer to make us take possession. Until we were what we must have wanted to be. Shapes, the shapelessness was taking back. Why should I lean out? Why should I move? That stalemate ends the domestic scene, but how will she end the poem? She will end with the picture of Orpheus torn apart by the Maenads, who sent his decapitated head down the river Hebrus, as Milton says in Lycidas, to the shore, and the head sang all the way. She's remembering the moment in Lycidas when the muse, says Milton, couldn't herself save her enchanting son, Orpheus. What could the muse herself that Orpheus bore? The muse herself for her enchanting son? Nothing. When the Maenads tear Orpheus limb from limb, they throw his head out into the river. Unbodied, it sings all the way downstream, all the way to the single ocean, head floating in current, downriver singing, until the sound of the cataracts grows, until the sound of the open ocean grows, and the voice. The voice tallies the song of the decapitated head and will stop when the head reaches the ocean, goes over the cataracts, over the waterfall, over the precipice, into the ocean. So far, it's been a poem about her dread of war, whether domestic or national, ending with the mythological victim, the poet who was torn apart and decapitated, but his head continues singing until it is gone. This means that all she can do about the plains and their ultimate end in human screams is write about it, sing about it, until she dies, and there will be no more voice to tally the events. I want to stop for a moment to say that you can see this poem is written in stanzas. There are spaces, white spaces, giving a kind of periodic rhythm to the poem, but it doesn't rhyme. It depends on its rhythms to carry it along, and it depends on its structure, the jump cut between the national and the domestic, to carry it as well. But there's a third item that carries it, and it's the most mysterious point of the poem, in which the poet says, looking down from, you might say, God's point of view, in line 39, how does it look from up there now, the meadow we lie in our bellies in? This field, iconography tells me, stands for sadness, because the wind can move through it uninterrupted. What is it the wind would have wanted to find and didn't, leafing down through this endless admiration unbroken, because we're too low for it to find us? This mysterious passage allegorizes the whole question of why we want to make icons out of certain moments of experience. Iconography is the science of interpreting signs that human beings have made to represent experience. It can be the iconography of paintings. It can be the iconography of Capitol buildings, like our too tall Washington Monument and our too long reflecting pool, as Lowell says. It can be the iconography of ordinary signs, stop signs. But signs show that something has been intended, something has been written down, erected, put up, monumentalized. The Vietnam Wall, all of those signs say, I was here. Human presence was here. Human presence has left a mark here. When human presence doesn't record the moments of history, then the wind of history can pass through as it would pass through a field of grass uninterrupted. No obstacles, no blockage, nothing that it has to notice. When there's nothing to be noticed, life remains unrecorded. And all the beauties of the earth, all the admirations that an eye could go down through, if they haven't been recorded, become invisible for the rest of history. So that the recording function of the poet seems to her what needs to be said about these plains. I must make a mark to say there were planes here, running 24 hours a day, laden with bombs, manned by boys who at a signal will rise and bomb some unknown population, creating the thousands of screams that she hears in her inner ear. This is about history, not in action, but in preparation. She uses the word prepare about her domestic life and about the national life. One is always awaiting the something that will happen, the engine running, and then something comes and we make a sign of it. Say, I was here, this was here. It is about all human beings can do to create history is to record what has happened. Intervention in history, at least by poets, doesn't change history. As Auden said, poetry makes nothing happen. It can't stop a war, it can't kill anyone, it can't create a battle where there wasn't one. But what it can do is say, this was here and I was here. And a piece of history remains fixed instead of slipping away into the chaos of the unknown.